this presentation or the work behind it was funded in part by that federal contract, but these views are my own and do not represent official positions of the United States government. So with that out of the way, let's jump into it. So I just give a sense as to who we are. So as John mentioned, we are under the United States Department of Health and Human Services. There's a federal contract that serves for serving as the OPTN, or the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network, for over 30 years. UNOS, the company that I work for, has held that contract with the federal government, and that means that we administer the nation's organ transplantation network. So what is it that we do? At the OPTN, we like to say that we save lives together, and the reason for that is because not only do we oversee the transplantation of organs throughout the country, but we really do that in partnership with lots of different stakeholders. Those are the hospitals that are caring for potential donors, living and deceased, as well as hospitals that are caring for patients in need of a transplant, the organizations that actually facilitate the allocation across the country and ship the organs and allocate and place the organs and talk with donor families, as well as all the laboratories that do the necessary clinical workup for transplantation, as well as the researchers and stakeholders and patient families and ethicists that are part of what we call our transplant community. It's a really large community. It's a small part of medicine overall in the world, but it's a rather large and diverse community that we work with on a day-to-day basis. And not to put too fine of a point on it, but the decisions we make are truly life and death decisions. And so when we take our charges very seriously, and we wanted to take a moment to really work on improving the how we allocate organs for transplantation and how we develop those policies as well. So just to give you a little bit of background on organ transplantation, right now there's about 100,000 people in the United States that are waiting for organ transplantation. Organ transplantation occurs in dozens of countries around the country. The United States has the largest transplantation system. We like to think it's the best as well, but there's no question that it is the largest transplantation network in the world. We recently performed our millionth transplant here in the United States. We're quite proud of that. But unfortunately, there's not enough donors to meet the demand of people in need of a transplant. So while there's 100,000 100,000 candidates waiting for transplant right now, we know that there aren't going to be enough organs for all of those individuals in need of a transplant. And so for that reason, we have to allocate the scarce resource, this gift of life that we have in organ transplantation. And in doing so, it's a rather complex system. I'm not going to go through this entire flowchart, but just to give you a sense, there are lots of different steps and lots of different players whenever we are dealing with organ transplantation. It's very rich in clinical and operational data, legal requirements, and ethical controversies. And the important part to realize here is just that there are lots of different players involved in organ transplantation. And some of you can probably start to see where I might be going with that in terms of discussing AHP. And so we wanted to find a system and a methodology that allowed us to collect preferences from this very rich and very interested and diverse set of stakeholders in our community. And so, as I said, there's lots of different stakeholders within here. We have the patients themselves that are either waiting for a transplant or have received a transplant, the families of those that have donated organs. We try to include all of them in the process, as well as the clinicians, the surgeons and physicians, the nurses that are taking care of these patients. There's also a lot of people who dedicate their lives to researching how to improve organ transplantation on many different fronts. There's a lot of ethical issues here as well. And so there's a whole branch of bioethics that focuses on organ transplantation. And so we try to really have a collaborative and transparent policy development process here at the OPTN. We also recognize that there are a lot of really difficult issues that come up with organ transplantation because the stakes are so high. Again, they truly are life and death decisions. There's a lot of ethical debates that come up very quickly in transplantation. Should we prioritize the sickest of those, or should we prioritize those who have waited the longest? Maybe we should prioritize those individuals who would benefit the most from a transplant. Should children receive special considerations? How do we balance equity and utility? And how important is system efficiency compared to all these different goals? There's a multitude of different goals whenever you're looking at organ transplantation. And this is true no matter what country you're in regarding organ transplantation. As I said, that we're not the only country that performs organ transplantation, and we've talked with researchers around the world about how to collaborate and work on improving our systems together. And so because of these high stakes, unfortunately, in the last few years, our community is, I shouldn't say unfortunately, fortunately, they're very engaged and want to be engaged in developing and improving the system. But because of these high stakes, sometimes they will go outside of our traditional policy development processes. And recently there have been some members that have taken to outside avenues such as lawsuits or mass media and lobbying in order to influence these policy development projects that we work on. And so again, we wanted to find a way that we can improve our policy development process to give people more of an opportunity to participate in it, do so in an evidence-based way, do so in a consensus-driven fashion, so that ultimately there is more trust in the organ transplantation system as a whole, which will greatly improve those individuals that need a transplant to save their lives. I should also note there's also a fair number of legal requirements for this process as well. So we've been working so we've been working on a project that we call continuous distribution. This is really a generational change in how we're going to be allocating organs. We're quite proud of this work. And as John said, we've been working with his team at Decision Lens on part of this and have utilized their expertise and tools to move this forward. I just want to tell you a little bit about what this project is to give you the context as how it is that we used AHP to help form this. We were looking for a system that would be more flexible and more equitable. As I mentioned, there are a lot of different goals within organ transplantation. And so we wanted to find a way that we could properly balance those different goals. And we also wanted to find a way that we could do so that was representative of not only our legal requirements, but also, I should say, compliant with our legal requirements, but also representative of what the community's preferences were within those legal boundaries. What were the preferences of the community in order that we could optimize the system and have the most trust in the system. And so we have come up with a system that assigns points to candidates based upon multiple different goals. And so here's just a snapshot of what a potential, we call them match runs. And these are the lists of candidates that will receive offers for any given organ. And so you can see we have a list of candidates here, A through G, and you can see they receive a bunch of points. And you'll notice that, the person with the most points is on top and the person with the least points is, further down the list. And the reason for that is what we would do is we would allocate the organ to the person who is on the top of the list. A lot of folks think that it's a list in the sense of queuing like at Disney World, where you get in a line and it's the next person that gets the organ. And it's not that simple. It's much more complex than that. In fact, we receive, priorities for individuals and assign these points based upon a multitude of different factors, and they are changing multiple times throughout the day, depending upon the organ that's available and where it is, where the candidates are located, and so forth. And so you'll see on here multiple different colors associated with these different goals that we are trying to optimize throughout the entire day for the entire system for every organ that we are placing. And you'll see that all these different colors are represented across the different candidates. You'll then see that some of those bars, they're like, if you just take that blue bar, it gets bigger or it gets smaller. And that's because some candidates are more medically urgent than other candidates. So by and large, we want to give, more points if you are sicker than if you can wait longer for an organ. And you'll also see that some of those bars, they're relatively large, like on the left-hand side, the blue and green ones, but then like the orange, purple, teal ones, they're relatively small. They never get that big. And that's because as a community, they prefer that we spend most of our priority points on these, on certain issues versus other issues. And so you can probably already see how this is building towards a classic AHP, exercise in terms of what the priorities should be in terms of assigning points to candidates on a match run. Just a little bit more about this project. Sorry, I keep clicking the wrong button there. So it gets even more complex in the sense that we wanted to have a system that is going to be consistent at a high level across all of our different organs. We allocate not just kidneys, but we allocate multiple different organs. Here's just a snapshot of a few different ones. So we wanted to have a consistent, system that we could use across all those organs. This framework makes it much more efficient for us to program, which means that we can be more nimble and flexible and agile as the clinical criteria are changing in the community, or as preferences, change in the community as well. We started with an additive score, which is similar, to what some other countries utilize, and we wanted to also have some common attributes and common goals across those different organs as well, so that again we could be equitable, and efficient across the different organs. But we also wanted to be able to change this as necessary for the different organs, because kidneys have different requirements than, say, hearts or livers or lungs. So just to let you know, we are making progress on this across all of the different organs. We're kind of taking this one organ or a set of organs at a time. Lung was the first one that we worked on. We started on that a couple years ago. That is set to go live for the country right after the new year. We're really excited about that. I'll tell you about the actual, clinical results for the community, towards the end of this presentation. But that was the first one that we started with. You'll see kidney and pancreas in blue and yellow in the middle there. They are moving along. They've already done their AHP exercises, and liver will be doing their AHP exercise right after the new year with the community, as well as we'll be moving heart in about 6 months. They should be doing their AHP exercise. So where does AHP fit into here? It's right here in this third step where we talk about prioritizing attributes against each other. We have a rather formal policy development process that we work through here. But one of the really important parts of this, as you can probably already imagine, is trying to decide, we have these 5 goals. Well, which one is the most important? And the law tells us that we have many of these different goals, but the law doesn't tell us that this one has to be worth half of your points, and this one can only be worth, say, 5% of your points. And so we have behind the scenes been having these conversations for years, but we wanted to bring this conversation forward and have it in a more structured manner. And so that's where we looked to AHP to help us really structure that conversation for the community. And so these are the different goals that we came up with in putting together our AHP exercise for the community, which is our goal is obviously the transplant organs. That's our overall goal. And then there are federal statutes and regulations that really lay out some of our sub-goals, if you will, for the overall goal of transplanting organs. And those are that we want to decrease waitlist mortality. Another way of thinking about that is we want to transplant those candidates that are going to be the sickest first. And that's going to be different depending upon whether you are a kidney candidate, a heart candidate versus a lung candidate. We needed different ways to measure that, across the different organs. We also want to make sure that the organs that we do transplant are going to those people that are going to be able to use them the most. And so we want to have what we call the best post-transplant outcomes. So those individuals that do receive transplants, we want them to use those organs for as long as possible. And there are different ways that we can match organs in order to do that. Unfortunately, we know that there's also some disadvantages for individuals built into the system. And at a simple level, I just use the example of height, which is if you take a little infant, they're about so big, and they're going to need, a heart or a liver that's about, say, so big. Well, you can't take the heart or a liver from a 7-foot basketball player and put that into a little infant. It's just not going to work. And conversely, you can't take the organs from an infant and place them into a 7-foot basketball player. They're not going to work for those candidates. And so people at the extreme ends of these of different biological characteristics have an inherent disadvantage. They can't accept organs from just anybody on the list. And so we wanted to find a way that we can reduce what we call these biological disadvantages by awarding points for these candidates that are disadvantaged. We also have special populations that we need to care for, prior living donors, people that have already donated an organ in the past. We have a duty to care for them, and so we award them points if they ever are in need of an organ transplantation. We also award points for children for various legal and ethical and clinical reasons, and then ultimately, any system, you want to be efficient. And so these are all great goals, but like any organization, you want it to be as efficient as possible. And efficiency can mean lots of different things. There's dollars and cents, but then there's also the time it takes to transplant. There's making sure that you utilize as many of the organs as possible. You certainly don't want to lose out on any of these gifts of life. And so we want to, maximize how much we're getting out of the system. And so how do we then take that, and start collecting some values and using that to help score candidates along the way? And that's really the next step, which is we would take these goals and we would come up with rating scales for each of these different attributes. We would assign those scores for each of the different candidates that are in here. Now, sometimes I know in our AHP exercises, we're talking about dozens of different alternatives. In our particular situation, we started off with lung because that's a relatively small volume organ where we would have to grade 1,000 candidates across all of these different goals. Moving forward, we're now working on the kidney system. That system alone has about 90,000 candidates in it at any given time. So the numbers start increasing quite rapidly. And so that's why we wanted to make sure that we had, a well thought out and established methodology for assigning these points and for collecting these preferences for the different candidates that we have in the system. And so what we did is we then came up, we have these 5 goals on top that you saw on the previous screen: medical urgency, post-transplant survival, candidate biology, patient access, and placement efficiency. And then you'll see that we have just a sampling of some of the organs that we work with, on the vertical of our table here. And you'll see that we then started coming up with what we're calling attributes, for the different ideas that we want to use to distinguish and sort the different candidates. And we have different scoring mechanisms for each of these. So what we're calling rating scales for each of these. And so you'll see almost all of them have some sense of medical urgency. We actually don't have a way to measure that with Pancreas right now. And so we're going to assign 0 points for that right now. And we're working on that to, include that in the future. You'll also notice that we don't currently have scores for how to measure post-transplant survival, or really how to predict post-transplant survival for some of the organs right now. And so we're going to assign 0 points there, but we'll leave that open for future, improvements in the system. And so what I wanted to get across on here is that we have these 5 goals so we can have a consistent framework across all of our organs. And you'll notice that some of the organs don't have, everything filled out right now. And that is a way that's helping us prioritize, work for the future. But then what you also see is you'll see some similarities. So you'll see we use blood type and we use prior living donors and pediatrics on all of these. And then you'll see there are some things that are really unique to each organ. So how we measure medical urgency for each of the organs is truly unique to each organ. You know, the lung disease is very different than kidney disease or heart disease. And so obviously we would need different systems for measuring that. And so how did we do once we came up with this? As I said, we're taking this one organ at a time. And so the first organ that we did was lung. And what we did is after we, sorry, I just had a pop up on my screen there. So once we brought this to our board, we brought this to our board of directors, and it was adopted in December of last year. These were the weights that, after consultation with the community, we received kind of 25% on the first goal of decreasing waitlist mortality, 25% on improving post-transplant outcomes, another 25% on improving patient access, then 15% on reducing biological disadvantages, and 10% on improving organ placement efficiency. And to me, this is fascinating from somebody that really works in organ transplantation, because for years, folks have kind of asked us, well, how important is efficiency, or how important is waitlist mortality? We've never been able to place a number on it before, or we've been able to measure the outcomes of this. As I said, our industry is rich with data and clinical data and outcomes data, as well as pre-transplant data. But in terms of this kind of a concept of where are we placing our priorities, we'd never been able to quantify that before. And so this was the first time that we had structured our proposals in this fashion. And it's been really well accepted in our community. Now, before I kind of get into the AHP exercise itself, I should note that we really saw it throughout this project that it was quite important that we find a system that was going to be very transparent. And there's lots of different ways that you can define transparency in public policy development. And so, excuse me, as I said earlier, I'm getting over the flu. But as I said earlier, there's a real value in transparency. And if you've never read this book, I highly recommend it, which is called Weapons of Math Destruction. And the author really talks about the value of transparency in public policy and what I think of as public algorithms. And transparency includes the ability to see the inputs that are going into the system. It includes the ability to see the outputs from the system, to be able to participate in the development of the system, to make sure that there's a public review after there's implementation of the system. And we wanted to make sure that we had transparency really throughout the entire policy development process. And I think we've done a really great job here at UNOS and the OPTN over the years on many different aspects of that. But one of the aspects that we have struggled with is on the upfront policy development side, getting input from the community into the system. A lot of times when we would ask our questions, we would propose these complex algorithms, and we would put out lengthy papers explaining the science behind them, so that we were very transparent about this is how the system will operate, here's the science behind it, and we would ask people for their feedback on that. And we would get lots of great feedback from clinicians and other scientists and experts in the arena, but we weren't able to reach out to patients and really receive their input into this process. And looking back on it, it's because we were really mixing different conversations into one. We were mixing these very complex clinical and scientific conversations with what I call these values-laden conversations of what's most important. Should we be focused on waitlist mortality? Should we focus on prioritizing children? Should we be focused on geographic inequities? Well, you need a lot of background to participate in that first conversation, those scientific and clinical conversations. I'm not a doctor. I didn't go to medical school. I don't understand all those conversations. But anybody can participate in this second conversation about what's most important. Should we be maximizing, children, or, should we have equal access for all? Anybody can have an opinion about this. And that frankly impacts all of us, because You don't know whether or not you're ever going to be in need of an organ, or somebody in your family is going to be in need of an organ. And so any one of us could be touched by this, and any one of us could have an opinion on this. And that's why it's so important that we have public trust in the system. So we wanted a system that was going to be able to be used by everybody. And that's why we eventually settled on AHP. We looked at several different tools. As you surely all know better than I do, there are lots of different branches within operational science that focus on multi-criteria decision making and other methodologies out there. But we were really intrigued by AHP because of the ability for the community to participate in this. And one of the folks that really helped us on this was Dr. Tom Dolan, who has used AHP in the medical setting for shared decision making between patients and physicians. And so he really helped us structure our model so that we would be working with patients and their families, as well as physicians, so that we could do this almost in a shared clinical setting. So this did require quite a bit of resources in different ways. This was new to our organization. This was new to our framework. We've been doing policy development for a long time, but AHP was new to us. And so one of the first things that we needed to do was really educate our community about this. What is this process that we're taking on? What does AHP stand for? Why are we taking these different, surveys, if you will? And so we had a series of online courses and in-person courses. We started this pre-COVID, so we actually had a traveling road show, if you will, that we went to different regional meetings across the country to meet with folks interested in transplantation, to teach them about AHP and teach them about this exercise, as well as having online courses and virtual town halls for people to learn about the exercise, learn about how transplantation works, so that they would be comfortable and informed enough to participate in the AHP exercise before we did this. We also had to get buy-in from our community on the methodology. Our community is well versed in different scientific methods, but this was new to many of the clinicians that focus on organ transplantation. Luckily, it wasn't hard to sell them on it because AHP has such a rich history, and so there were already multiple papers written about using AHP for organ transplantation. And so we contacted those authors who were very generous with their time to work with us as we put this together, and to talk with our oversight bodies in order to explain the methodology to them and the benefits of AHP. John and his team also helped us, show where AHP has been used in other governmental decisions, whether they were public policy or other types, so that this, kind of to give the credibility of AHP, in a governmental setting, since this was new to HHS, or at least within organ transplantation, we wanted to make sure that our oversight bodies and the community were comfortable with the approaches that we were taking to develop these new organ allocation policies. And so for those of you that, have worked with John before, you've probably seen a slide similar to this, which is, this is how our AHP, process or exercise worked once we rolled this out to the community. It started off with defining the criteria. Again, we had those 5 goals that we talked about earlier in terms of waitlist, mortality, post-transplant outcomes, access, efficiency. Then we had some sub goals underneath those, or what we were calling attributes when we talked with our community. We then used the Decision Lens platform, and we used that because we wanted to include the entire transplant community with this. And so we wanted to open this up to hundreds and thousands of individuals across the country for this AHP exercise. And we did it. I have to say, we were nervous the first time that we rolled this out, since it was new, but it worked extremely well. And once folks, they went through the training that I mentioned earlier, and we also gave them background documents on how the system works and methodology behind this. They made those all available to all of the users beforehand. They were then able to go into the system. They were given your classic pairwise, comparisons that you see in AHP, where they were presented with each of these different, criterion or the different goals that we had in the system, and asked to weigh those against each other. And then, obviously, as you know, using the classic 1 to 9 scale of AHP. And we also, one of the reasons that we liked this tool as well is because it also allowed you to provide written comments in here as well, which is something that our community was very accustomed to, and we also find very helpful once we started diving into the results about how to fine-tune the algorithm once it was done. And then once we had the each of the individuals would go through the pairwise comparisons, they they have varied, to about 20 pairwise comparisons or so. Each of them took about 15 minutes or so, is what we saw on. So we looked back on the timestamps in the system to complete each of the exercises. Each individual was then able to receive, a snapshot of what their priorities would be in the system. And we asked them to hold on to that for a couple different reasons that I'll get to down the road. But obviously the system then was able to collect those for us, and was then able to aggregate those across the entire country as well. But before we get to that, one of the first things that we saw as we were working on this is who should be involved with this. And so, as I said, we have a very large community that was involved with this. And you can see in the middle, without me really giving too much description here, you can see that one group participated with much more volume and enthusiasm than other groups did in the transplant community. And that's not atypical for us. I should say that we are used to sending out our papers, for comment. We put them out for what we call public comment. And most of the individuals that participate in that process are transplant hospitals. And that wasn't any different when we did this with the AHP. What I should note, though, is that the number of patients that we had involved in the AHP exercise, at least the first couple ones that we did, really jumped up for us. And so while it wasn't as high as the number of transplant professionals that participate in this, we usually only received 1 or 2 or 3 or a handful of patient, comments on any given proposal. And as I said, it was really difficult for patients to give really substantive feedback onto our proposals, because we were mixing these clinical, scientific conversations with these values-laden conversations. And so what we saw on the patient engagement here is it jumped up to about 50 individuals on the first exercise that we did, but it was really substantive and really engaging feedback from the patient community, and they appreciated that as much as we appreciated that. And so we were, quite proud of the work that we were able to do, collecting information from patients in these different exercises. And so, as I mentioned, really we opened this up to the entire country. We've done 3 of these exercises now. You'll notice that lung was the first one, and the volume jumped up considerably when we went to kidney and pancreas. As I mentioned, their wait lists are much larger, and so they're, the field of individuals that are involved in that is much larger as well. And so we expected that volume to grow. And I think it also grew because people had more confidence in the system. And we also learned how to utilize the system for our purposes as well. But the other thing that we realized as soon as we started seeing these demographic charts is that it really didn't make sense to look at just the aggregate of all of the individuals, that participated in the AHP exercise, because if we did that, then the views would be slanted towards one demographic group, namely the transplant hospitals in the middle of the screen, since they were participating at such a higher volume than the other individuals. And so we used a few different methodologies to look at the results by different demographic groups, and then also to try to combine them into a national picture as well. So some of the methodologies that we used weren't necessarily, statistical methodologies, but one was that we used a Delphi method, which has been written about previously with AHP. We have committees of experts that are cross-disciplinary committees, so they have physicians, surgeons, really that whole makeup that I was talking about earlier. Patients, coordinators, administrators, researchers are on each of these different committees. So we had our lung committee sponsor the first one, our kidney committee sponsored the kidney proposal, and so on and so forth. And what we did with the committee is we had the committee take the AHP exercise multiple times. So we took it to get a baseline of this is what the committee's preferences were. Then they would discuss them, receiving anonymous results. Though again, we asked them to record their personal results, or we were able to reproduce them for them, so that then they could see how their results compared to the aggregate of the entire committee. And we did this in a iterative fashion. And as they were discussing the questions, they would tweak the definitions of the goals or have a different understanding of maybe why one person may value one goal versus another. And so we saw gradual shifts, towards consensus using the Delphi method, within the committee. We also then layered in bringing in, after the committee did this, we then brought in and showed them the national results to see how did the committee's results compare with the results from the entire community that we had done online. And again, they had those discussions, and again, we're building more towards consensus. In some cases, though, what we saw is that there were some communities that were really different. They had very different perspectives than others. And so in those situations, we looked, to ask questions of those communities. Again, we liked the tool that we used because it allowed people to provide written explanations in addition to just the quantitative. And so we could look at those comments to try to understand why they were valuing one goal versus another. But then we also set up focus groups with those specific demographic groups, say the patients or the physicians, to better understand their perspectives versus another perspective. And then we could walk through their AHP results, with them and inquire, a little bit deeper about what results they had. And then, there's been a couple different, sessions at this conference here, and certainly numerous different papers written about how to statistically, quantify the levels of consensus, across different groups. And we tried several different methods as well to quantify that. Ultimately, what we were driving towards was to see that we were gaining more consensus, across the community as we were working through this project. And so here's just a couple, of the charts that we showed to the community and the committee, as we were working through this project. This first one is really just the rank ordering. It doesn't show you the absolute values, but instead it would show you which goals, each of the different demographic groups, placed as most important versus least important. And so you can see right away that there's some things that are pretty consistent. That blue dot you'll see for pediatrics is usually near the top, certainly in the top half, for everybody. But obviously, those of you here, I don't need to explain to you that you understand that just looking at the ranking of each of the priorities isn't sufficient. It doesn't tell you if you're off by just a little or you're off by a lot. And so while this was a nice way to see some obvious, discrepancies, we wanted to go a little bit further. And so that AHP obviously allows you then to quantify the absolute, values that we were getting out of the different demographic groups. And so here are some of the results that we received on the kidney exercise that we did. And here you'll see some similarities, commonalities, as well as discrepancies between the different demographic groups. So you'll see that light blue one at the top is generally speaking, highly weighted. But there's a real difference between placing 25% of your score versus 14% of your score on medical urgency. And so we wanted to, again, talk with those communities about why would there be, such a difference between those scores. And that's where we worked on the iterative fashion in the focus groups, as well as reading the written comments with the communities to understand these differences in order to build more consensus over time. And I should also note, excuse me, So here's also another one that we did with Pancreas. And again, you'll again see that there are some commonalities, in terms of what's most important versus least important. It's relatively consistent across the different demographics, but the specific values themselves, there's pretty wide ranges on some of these. And so that's where we then worked with the different demographic groups to redo the exercises and build on these focus groups in an iterative fashion so that we could build consensus moving forward. So as I mentioned earlier about transparency, we thought it was really important that the community understand the impact of what these weights would be in a real world setting. So we also put together this interactive tool. It's still available on Tableau Public. If you go and search for the OPTN or continuous distribution, you can find these. And so what this allowed folks to do was not to participate in the AHP exercise, but to understand, once you have these weights, what does the impact really mean? And so that's what we tried to do through this interactive tool. As you also know, that whenever you're building AHP, a really critical part of that is building the rating scale that goes into each of these different attributes. And they can be lots of different types of rating scales. You can have binary ones, like you either are or are not a pediatric candidate. They could be categorical. You're a certain blood type and you get so many points for that blood type. Or they could be a continuous scale. And that scale could be linear, like you see on the screen, or it could be a curve, or it could be, multiple, splines. So there's lots of different options that we presented to the committee. And this tool here allowed the community to actually select the different scales and then see what that impact would be onto different transplant populations and transplant candidates. And so we wanted to make this as interactive and transparent to the community as possible. And so here's just one example of what I'm talking about, which is you can also change the weights in this interactive tool that we had put together. And so here you can just change the weights of these two, characteristics that we have, out of our total, algorithm that we put together. And you can see how the individual candidates will move up or down in the system, using, the scores that were assigned to the different candidates. And a lot of folks, for them, this was when the exercise really started to click, was once they're able to see the impact of changing weights and changing the way that we score candidates. We were intentional in that we did not release this in advance of the AHP exercise, because we didn't want people to be able to say, oh, I want this candidate, to be at the top. Therefore, I'm going to try in the back of my mind, to weigh this goal more heavily than another goal. So we were intentional in that we did not release this until after the AHP exercise, so that folks could come to the AHP exercise kind of in a de novo setting, if you will. And so here's just another example where you can see that you can enter in different clinical characteristics about a candidate and see how they're scored. It also allows you, if you click on the buttons on the bottom, to change the weights of any of the given attributes that we have, or to change the different rating scales that we have. As I mentioned, whether it's going to be linear or not non-linear, or the various different options that the committees were discussing at the time. I should also note that AHP really was not the only methodology that we used in developing this new pathway for organ transplantation. We also worked with MIT in terms of mathematical optimization. Mathematical optimization, if you will, it almost kind of, the way we used it here was we flipped AHP on its head, which is we started with the outcomes in mind, and then we asked, well, can we then calculate the weights that are necessary to achieve those goals? And so, for example, this slide shows us what are the weights that we would needed if we wanted to really benefit, pediatric candidates. How much weight would we need to do to put them at the top of the list? And there was some of the community that really wanted us to pursue this path alone, just use mathematical optimization without AHP. And I really pushed back and said that we really need the two, and the two are really quite complementary. Earlier, you'll remember I mentioned that previously we didn't have a baseline as to what the preferences were from the community. And we didn't have a great way of asking the community for those preferences either. We've been very transparent, have used public comment for decades, but as I said, the clinicians and the scientists were able to participate in those conversations, but we didn't have a great mechanism for asking these questions about values. And in order for the mathematical optimization exercise to work, you really already have to have a sense as to what your values are. And so we use the AHP exercise to ask what's most important. What is it that we're trying to prioritize? What is it that we want to optimize, if you will? And we can then set that as our outcome, if you will, and then we can fine tune our algorithms using the mathematical optimization. And so in that way, we're using AHP together with mathematical optimization. And I don't think that the project would have been as successful if we had chosen one path without the other path, but it's really bringing the two together so that you're looking at the same coin from both sides, if you will, in order to optimize the community and optimize the algorithm and engage the community in a meaningful conversation. And as I mentioned, we also didn't have a baseline as to what the how the current system worked. So we also had tried what is called a revealed preference analysis to look back on the current policies in order to quantify these. This was one of the analyses that we shared with the community during the exercise after they had done the AHP exercise. First, we wanted to ask them, kind of in an ideal setting, what should be the weights? Where should we be placing our priorities when we are scoring candidates? This revealed preference analysis then said, here's where we have been placing our emphasis. Here's where we have been, placing points. If we had been using a points-based score for the last 30 years, here's where it should be. So then we were able to have a conversation about, well, here's your ideal based upon the AHP exercise, and then here's your reality based upon the revealed preference analysis, and see the gaps between the two to understand how big of a gap is there, how close were we, why might there be a difference, and should we be shifting in one direction versus another. And so this was really helpful, and I think also really shifted some of the conversations within the community in a very positive manner as well, that I don't think would have been possible if we weren't able to collect from the community. Here's what the community's preferences are, as expressed through the AHP exercise. This revealed preference analysis really was most useful in comparison to that idealized version that we collected through the AHP exercise. And I told you I'd kind of finish off here with what the real world impact of all of this is. It's been a huge success. So long as our smallest organ, or one of our smallest organs by volume, as I mentioned, there's only about 1,000 lung candidates waiting for transplant at any given time, which is small in comparison to liver. And this had a huge impact on, saving lives there. So as we calculate wait list mortality, and through this project alone, we estimate that we're going to be able to reduce overall long waiting list mortality by more than a third. And so in real world terms, what that means is that's 170 families that are going to have, extra special birthdays and holidays and anniversaries in this coming year, thanks to our ability to really transform how we are developing organ transplantation throughout this country, with the ability to receive input from the community about their priorities in the AHP exercise and these other methodologies that I was talking about. And for that, I think, as I said at the very beginning of this, our decisions truly are life and death decisions. And so right here, is the proof of how many lives we're going to be able to change in just the next year. And so with that, I thank you again for inviting me to speak at your symposium this week. It's really been an honor to be here and to be amongst all of you, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James. That's just really fantastic. Really appreciate it. Yeah, definitely open up the floor to any questions for James that folks may have.
Yes, I have one.
Please.
How long it took you to learn decision lens to implement it? How much time did you spend?
So John has a great team that has a large educational component there. So we probably spent about, if I wanted to kind of put it into pieces, we spent maybe 6 months, talking about different methodologies, then looking at, kind of honing in on AHP. And then I would say another 6 to 12 months really working on how we wanted to put the AHP exercise together and release that to the community, including selecting the vendor and, tailoring the tool to our needs.
Mm-hmm. And if I am allowed, I would like to ask one more question. It is
Sure.
on slide 29. Slide 29. This is not AHP related, but what does it mean rank correlation 0.93? What does it mean candles toll 0.80? I don't know this part of statistics, so if you could explain that, I may not understand.
Yeah, sure. So what this means is, so looking at what this analysis did is, if we were to assign points to our candidates in the current system, this is kind of an approximation of what that system would look like. And it says that it would be accurate for, 0.9 means, 90% of those candidates, we would have, accurately predicted their rank in the current system. So it means it's a pretty good approximation.
Yeah. What about candles toll? What does it measure? I was with candle a long time ago, but I don't know what is this candles toll means.
I'm not enough of a statistician to be able to.
Okay, no problem. We can ask Google. Thank you very much. It was outstanding. Thank you very much. It was so inspiring. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? One comment I just want to make, and James, you brought this to life for us, but when I opened the symposium this morning, one of the things I was focusing on was really, how do you operationalize decision making, right? It's one thing to do sort of a study. It's another thing to really operationalize it. There's a lot of naysayers. You really have to fight the fight and convince people, but also put in place. I think part of what you showed that was really important was the whole flow of where this piece sits in a much larger picture of this continuous distribution network. One thing I'd love to, if you could just talk to, this is going live in January with lungs. Congratulations on getting that through. What does that look like? What does that production switchover look like for UNOS?
Yeah, sure. So we're going to be going live early in the next year with this. And so what that looks like on our side, we program all of our policies. So we could tell all of the hospitals to go out there and, calculate their own scores, but obviously that would be wildly inefficient. And so our computer programmers are, programming our system so that as the hospitals enter clinical data about their candidates, we're able to calculate their scores in real time. We are receiving and offering organ offers, multiple times throughout the day, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And so they are getting that computer system ready. Some of these attributes are going to require some new data collection, so that part of the system has already gone live. We actually had a webinar earlier today with the community members, and this has really required a lot of education for the community as well about how this new system is going to work, as well as building out these interactive tools so that candidates will really have some new insights into this system about how it is that they are prioritized on the system. As I mentioned, it's not like queuing at Disney World. There's a lot of different pieces that go into this, and your score is going to be different for different organs on different days, depending upon where you are as a person clinically and the characteristics of that organ.
And if nobody else has a question, I have one more question, or a suggestion, actually. We have another AHP and P session in iForce, and it is in Chile, San Diego. It is this July. We would be delighted to see you there. And if you are skiing, you can ski there. And although it is AHP and field supply chain, but we can fit this somewhere. So I think our audience will be really delighted to have you. And
with John and Elena, if you can get me her contact information, I'll be happy to follow up with you.
Okay, we'll do that, James. Yeah, Chile in July.
And we have another one in Tunisia. It is in 2024. That will be outstanding. We will be well hosted there. It will be very inexpensive like this one. It is supported, and we will be at the resort, and it is summertime. And I suggest you to fly from Istanbul, because they have so many flights and so many inexpensive flights. We are stated in New York, I think. Are you in New York?
He's in Richmond.
It doesn't matter, in US. So you can go to Istanbul and you can visit Istanbul, then go to Tunisia, attend this meeting. You will just love it. A lot of it is MCDM. There are the other methodologies, but we have whole session just AHP AMP. So you don't need to go any other session. You can see the different applications.
So a quick introduction to Dr. Birsen Karpak, who was a close colleague of my father's. She is Turkish. She's actually in Istanbul now, I believe. And this is part of the reason that we have so many Turkish participants across the conference is Birsen's effort, her network. She's on the organizing committee. So she's really a leading light in this, and no small voice. So, thank you, Birsen.
I appreciate that.
And we all thank Tom bringing all of us together. So that's why this is the most used methodology. Of course, it is the best one, but that is not the only reason that it is most used, because of all these connections. We are like a family.
We were, as I said, we looked at, the whole kind of sphere of multi-criteria decision making, and this AHP really stood out to us for all of the different virtues that it holds.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, thank you. We'll wrap up this plenary session now. And James, once again, thank you so much. And you may have a lot more invites to other multi-criteria conferences after this. So we'll be happy to support your participation. But thank you so much again.
Thank you so much for having me.
James.